Can you hear me? Now? Okay. Okay, good afternoon everybody. Okay, now you can hear me. Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Hope you are enjoying your staying here in Perugia for International Journalism Festival, despite the weather, which is very cold today. Before we start, we would like to remind you that you can listen for the event also with translation in Italian or in English. Please put your headset, they will distribute headset for you at the entry if you need them. And then there will be a chance to ask questions afterwards, so think about it, and afterwards you can maybe approach here to the panel and make a question. We will not use microphones, of course, for COVID reasons, but you can approach the panel here. So thank you for joining us today, and as you probably know, today we will have a very interesting conversation about climate change. And of course, the theme is climate change adaptation. And we will go through the urgent stories of small-scale farmers around the world and how to bring this theme to the media table. You know, a lot of media coverage is being made and about climate change. It is, of course, increasing in our media, but still we have to focus on stories of small-scale farmers. We have to hear their voices. Last November, the COP26 in Glasgow received a huge coverage, and we journalists, we remember the crowds of journalists trying to pick up accreditations in queues, because thousands of journalists came over all around the world to attend this event. Next month, we will also follow carefully the COP15 on desertification in Abidjan, West Africa. And in just 6 months, we will have the COP27, which will take place in Egypt. So during all these events, we are following carefully, of course, we hear from governments, from policymakers, first of all about mitigation in policies, how to tackle climate change. But we hear, as I said, very little from farmers, from people who every day have to face every day the task to see what is going on with the new climate we are experiencing, which means persistent droughts, which means floods, which are every day more frequent, and also rising sea levels. So why we do not hear from farmers, and why it is so important that we really start giving them a voice. So this is the theme today for us. So let me introduce you to our panelists, which is Lara Gilmore. Lara, she, together with her husband, Massimo Bottura, Lara launched Food for Soul, which is a way to redefine the role of the traditional soup kitchens, but also fighting food waste and social isolation altogether. She has worked in the culinary world for more than 20 years now, and she continues to dedicate her energy to expand the work of Food and Soul and amplify this message to a wide audience. We are also very pleased to have with us Joe Puri, who is Associate Vice President in the Strategy and Knowledge Department at the UN IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And she is leading the organization strategy work in key areas about agriculture, climate, gender, also nutrition, youth, and social inclusion, which is also a key theme, very, very near to us. Puri has also worked for the Green Climate Fund, UNEP, the World Bank, and the UNDP. So, and joining us virtually is Matt McGrath, an environment correspondent for BBC. Hi, Matt. My pleasure to meet you. He has covered climate change and environment for the BBC since 2006 and has reported on the major events in that period, including the recent COP in Glasgow we were talking about previously. And he has worked for many media, also radio and TV. Finally, but most importantly, we have right behind me from the Philippines, live, Estrella Penunia. Hi, Estrella. Pleasure to meet you. She's Secretary General of the Asian Farmers Association for Sustainable Rural Development, which is an alliance of 22 national farmers organizations across 16 Asian countries, made of men and women who are engaged every day in crops, livestock, fisheries, herding, pastoralism. So let's start with you, Estrella. You represent millions of farmers across Asian countries. You speak to them every day. So how you and the members of your organization have been really affected from climate change? And secondly, how do you think that small-scale farmers should be represented in the media? Estrella.
Yes, good afternoon to everyone who is here in this event. And thank you for your question. Actually, the effect of climate change is very personal to me because my husband and I, together with another farming family, has a farm. And currently, we do not have enough rains, and so our eggplants are just trying to survive. We are not having a good harvest. And 2 weeks ago, we almost had a forest fire because of all the dried leaves and grasses in the area and the very hot sun. Our members are suffering from a rising sea level. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, of course. Go ahead.
Yes, okay. Our farmers are being affected, are suffering from rising sea levels. Our members in Bangladesh are facing salinization of their water. And and rising sea levels also give rise to more intense droughts and storms and typhoons. In the Philippines, we average 20 typhoons a year, with 5 typhoons very destructive. And this means loss of crops, loss of properties, and even loss of lives sometimes. And the rising seas also escalate heat waves and droughts. In India, the people there are suffering from intense drought and heat waves, and this affects our health. And of course, nothing can grow on dry soil. So what we want for media is to cover not only the extreme weather events or natural disasters that affect us, but also the events that the unpredictable weather patterns that slowly but surely affect our yield and harvest and therefore incomes. Because amongst all the economic sectors, it is the small-scale family farmers in Asia Pacific, comprising from 30% to as much as 80% in some countries, that depends so much on the weather and the climate for a living. What we would ask media to do is that while we cry out for help, and most of the time media covers them, it is our initiatives on promoting sustainable, climate resilient, agroecological practices in our farms, fisheries, and forests would be covered. We have many practices, for example, on sustainable fisheries management, sustainable forestry management, integrated diversified agroecological practices in farms and forests. And these are making good results to our members. But if media can cover also what farmers are doing for climate resiliency, then we could have enough attention to help us support these initiatives with adequate financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Estrella. And now let's speak to Joe Puri, who is truly a climate expert at IFAD. And you just listened to Estrella, and IFAD, we have to remember, IFAD invests in rural people, small-scale producers, which are key for our world. And how do you think that small-scale farmers should be included in the media landscape, which is so crowded of different narratives on climate change?
Thank you, Marina. You've definitely hit a very, very sensitive note, at least in my body, because I always have a visceral reaction. Every time I think about the realities that we are facing with climate change, with uncertainty, on one side, and we look at the kind of pledges that are being made with respect to new climate finance. We saw that at COP26. We're going to see some more at COP27. So that, and then when I look at the 580 million small farms that are there across the world. So it's actually the total number of farms across the world today is 580 million. Of those, 85% are small, which means they are less than 2 hectares. These are the farmers that are most going to be affected by climate change because they just don't have the ability to withstand, as the previous speaker said, all of the uncertainty and the variability that comes because of changing in weather patterns. I was in Egypt just less than a month ago, and I was also in Mozambique a couple of months ago. Smallholder farmers there, people who are working 2 hectares or less, are also below the poverty line. We keep talking about new money that is coming from climate change. So for example, for climate change, so for example, 3 years ago, the overall new climate finance that was galvanized was approximately $580 billion. You know how much went to small-scale farmers? Less than 2%. You know how much that translates to per person in a household that is dependent on a small-scale farm? Less than $30 a year. And guess what? These are exactly the plots of land that are responsible for more than 1/3 of our food. So if you take your plate and you divide that into 3 parts, 1/3 of that is provided by smallholder farmers. And we are giving them abysmal quantities of money to deal with climate change. It's an inequitable equation, and we've got to correct it. The IPCC report that just came out on mitigation on the 4th of April talks about different sectors that now have the ability to deal with climate change. So wind, solar, these are all favored technologies that are provided for by governments and by international agencies to reduce their cost. Guess what? The agriculture, forest, and land use sector in the IPCC report has one of the maximum potential, has possibly the greatest potential in reducing the amount of carbon that we see in the atmosphere today. There's a beautiful chart out there that shows it. It is still contributing, food systems today are contributing more than 30% of the overall carbon to the atmosphere. So on one side, you've got great potential in the agriculture, forest, and land use sector, most of it being driven by small-scale farmers. You've got the possibility of greater investment and resources coming to small-scale farmers, 580 billion, but most of it goes into market-ready technologies. Very little actually goes to small-scale producers, and if the current crisis in wheat, in fuel, and in energy prices that we are witnessing as a consequence of the Ukraine crisis is any indicator of what we are going to be seeing, this is just a very, very small microcosm of the disruption that unfortunately we are going to be seeing as a consequence of climate change. Because we also know that when there is scarcity, the likelihood of conflict just goes up. And so we are unfortunately going to be living in an increasingly fragile world. And what we are witnessing today in terms of the disruption is a very, very small example of what is to come. I'm sorry that I'm a little bit of a naysayer in this conversation, but we do have solutions, and hopefully we can talk about those.
Yes, we will continue talking about that later also with questions. I hope the public is already thinking about it. And now we go to Matt now. Of course, as a journalist, Matt has been covering climate change stories and also been on the field worldwide about it. So I would like to ask Matt McGrath how he would improve media coverage and how can we bring attention to small-scale farmers.
Yeah, hi, hello everyone, and thank you for having me on this panel. I'm very I couldn't make it to Perugia, but it was an airline event in control. But listening to the passion coming from Joe and the info coming from Esther, I do kind of feel that this is all my fault as a journalist and working in this field for a long time. So I just wanted to be clear that, you know, I understand and get the powerful message that's coming from small-scale farmers. But I think sometimes in the telling of the stories, something is lost. The connection to journalists like myself isn't made and isn't, there's something lost in translation. The challenge from the IPCC report that Joe mentioned came out last week, and she's absolutely right. Agriculture, small-scale agriculture, is front and center in that report and how the world should tackle climate change. Particularly in the next 7 to 10 years, agriculture is seen as one of the most effective, most cost-effective methods of reducing emissions. But the question I would ask is, knowing that that was going to come out, why weren't people bending my ear, giving me case studies, showing me how this is happening in the world before the report has come out so that I'm ready to write that story, rather than telling me about it after the fact, when 1,000 other organizations are trying to bend my ear as well. So I come from a farming background in Ireland. I understand that that's very different from the existence of most farmers in most parts of the world. But, you know, I share and understand the difficulties of the realities of food production. I seem to have lost connection.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you, Matt. You can go ahead.
I'm sorry, I lost connection there for a minute, but I was just saying that I come from a farming background in Ireland. I understand that's different from the struggles of many small-scale farmers in many parts of the world, but I understand the challenges of producing food and the impacts that weather and climate have on people and their ability to do that. I'm very sympathetic to the field, and I'm very passionate about telling the story. So I'm ready. You've got the stories. I don't know what's happening to not connect us more clearly, and to get those stories out there.
Matt, usually we journalists always have small stories nicely to tell. There is somebody who you remember, a farmer or something that you would like to tell us, just to explain.
Yeah, I did a story about the IPCC in a number of years ago, actually 2014, when the last report came out. And I met a small-scale farmer in Japan who had adopted this model of going directly to his customers. He had about 100 families that he supplied. He had 2 hectares, produced incredible ranges of food, very climate resilient, highly organic, really, an incredible model. And I appreciate that that's in a richer country with many different issues, but it's always stuck with me as like, I had a meal with this man and his family, and it has left a lasting impression on me in terms of what can be done with so little, how important it is in the chain of everything that we do in the world. And yet, getting that story out is very, very difficult, and we continue to struggle with that.
Yes, thank you very much, Matt. And so you've been hearing now a farmer, a climate expert, a journalist, and now we would like to move a bit and change perspective, and we would like to talk with Lara Gilmore, who is really experiencing from within the food production and the food discourse, which is really based on what is going on in our climate, in our planet. So I would like to know how, Lara, what you're thinking about how this narrative has been changing towards the last 10 years, and how do you think it should change in the future?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and in this amazing space, which to me talks about the power of beauty. And as restaurateurs, that is something that we do every day. I think we collectively, restaurateurs, climate advocates, politicians, journalists, the public, I think we in this moment, this unique moment, have an opportunity to shape the future, to shape the way we eat, produce, talk about food, and also relate to nature. I would like to share some words from a Pasolini film, La Rabbia, from 1962. When the classical world is exhausted, when all the farmers and the artisans have died, when there are no more fireflies, bees, and butterflies, when industry has made the cycle of production unstoppable, then our history will be over. It is that dire, it is that important that we all listen to each other, a filmmaker, an artist, a chef, organizations like IFAD, that we work together. We as restaurateurs have a very unique position. We're always talking about food. We're creating beautiful environments for people to dine in and to remember and bring those memories home. We have influence on the way people think about the meal that they're going to cook or someplace they'd like to go. And for many years, Massimo and I, when we opened our restaurant in 1995, we thought only about ourselves and our small, maybe insignificant path to achieving a Michelin star, a better rating, another Michelin star, to that ultimate goal of finally reaching 3 Michelin stars after 18 years of work. And a very interesting thing happened when we did finally receive those stars. Massimo was hanging his chef's jacket in our bedroom because he couldn't believe that this thing had actually happened to him, that all the hard work and the struggles, he actually had been able to gain that recognition. But as that jacket, day after day, night after night, was hanging in our bedroom, we started to realize that those stars meant nothing unless we were going to use that voice to say something that had more relevance and more importance than what we were doing in the dining room. And so that's when we began to think about how we, restaurateurs, with a very small restaurant, 24 seats, a lemonade stand, really, in comparison to anything else, could make a difference in a small way, in our small circle of friends in our neighborhood. And as Expo was coming, 2015 to Milan, we realized that that was a moment with this incredible promise that Expo had claimed, feed the planet, energy for life. That's really big. And that was something that we could relate to, because that's what we do every day. We feed people. And so with that challenge, we basically took everything that we had learned in the years of the restaurant, and we applied it to something we knew nothing about, which is feeding people in need. Feeding people who are not going to pay a bill, who would never show up at your restaurant, never have the opportunity, or never even be considered worthy of walking through that door. And we decided to recreate a soup kitchen in a space like this, filled with beauty, with dignity, with designers, architects, and inviting chefs who were coming to Expo to do something, to take a little bit of their time, to do something unexpected, to experiment. The idea was that there was going to be so much surplus food from Expo, from a fairground, inevitable waste, that maybe, for once, instead of talking about production, we could talk about intervening in this chain of food waste and turning something unwanted, an ugly vegetable, some wilting carrots, some meat that's about to expire, some dairy, into a delicious and healthy meal in a celebratory place where there was joy and bringing people around the table as perhaps they'd never been invited before. We thought this project, this experiment, was going to be something that would last for 6 months of Expo. We were in a neighborhood in Milan called Quartiere Greco, and we had been able, with lots of help, to renovate a theater next to a church and turn it into a theater of life, turn it into Refettorio Ambrosiano. What we found out quite quickly was that this was not a 6-month pop-up project, but this was going to become kind of a life mission. 7 years later, we have 13 refettorios in 9 countries around the world. They're all very small. They're all very focused. We're intervening the chain of food waste. We're also inviting people in to combat social isolation, which is one of the most difficult things to fight because it is a quiet battle. Reinventing neighborhoods, creating community, creating more resilient cities, and addressing a need that all of us have, which is community. And community begins around the table. This project has taken over our lives. It's taken over our imagination. It's been difficult, struggle, but very rewarding, because as we are going down this path, as we open one refectory after another, along the way, we are meeting incredible people. This meeting itself with IFAD has opened my mind to how better we can also communicate what those small farmers, their stories, how they are struggling, and how their food is making a difference to their communities. But we can only begin with what we know how to do. And so we cook meals in these spaces, refettorios. Refettorio, the word comes from rificere, which means to rebuild or to remake. It is the model of where the monks would gather at the end of the day to talk about the day, to share that piece of bread, to share a meal, Because only when we look at each other in the eye and we share something, there's the possibility that one person's story is heard and another person's story is told. And I think that when we think about the power of journalism and how stories do get lost, it's because maybe we're not listening, and maybe we're not sitting around the table. Maybe we don't get out enough in our communities. And so if there's anything that I can do to address the issue of journalism getting closer to climate change, to social isolation, to fighting food waste, I invite you to come to a table in Merida, Mexico, in San Francisco, Harlem, New York, Milano at the Refettorio Ambrosiano, Naples, Rio de Janeiro. There are places where we can begin a conversation, but to begin that conversation, we have to be ready to listen. And so from a restaurant point of view, I can only say that when we began to invite chefs to be part of this project, to cook, that ignited a chain reaction. And they invited their young kitchen staffs to come and cook on our projects. And those young kitchen staff started talking to generation of their friends, and so forth and so on. And the message gets carried through experiences, personal and direct, that one can have simply by walking in the door, being a volunteer, and doing something. Because once you do something, your story becomes so much more real, and you have the words and the description to be able to tell it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Lara Gilmore, founder of Food for Soul, and also with her husband, Massimo Bottura. Thank you so much. And Lara...
Sorry, Massimo, I didn't mention you today. Everyone talks about Massimo, but he's the real motivator. I just pull the wagon.
Okay. Yes. So, Lara, you were speaking about social isolation, which is also a crucial theme. And cooking food is also something which united us, everybody. No? It's something, a language that we all share in the world. So that's why now we would like to show you this film, which is a world premiere. It's a fantastic way to go inside what we are talking about, to show you an example of how food can really, as you said, make a difference. Some food, some crops, some vegetables can really make a difference for farmers who are struggling towards climate change. And so IFAD, who has been investing on this, has been through also a series which is Recipe for Change. And IFAD has sent famous chefs around the world to follow to their projects, visit and cook with the farmers. And some weeks ago, Italian chef Carlo Cracco, he traveled to Sri Lanka and learned how to cook with the jackfruit, which is a particular fruit which is really prodigious, and you will see it in this movie. Okay, we can start.
One of Italy's most famous chefs, Carlo Cracco, has travelled to Sri Lanka to learn about a common local fruit and how it is helping rural communities adapt to climate change.
Il jackfruit, che è un frutto incredibile perché cresce in maniera naturale, non ha bisogno di nulla, si può fare una ricetta piuttosto che un'altra, perciò ha tanti utilizzi. È un modo intelligente di sostituire alcuni ingredienti che magari facciamo fatica a trovare con qualcosa di autoctono, qualcosa che c'è qui, che è a disposizione. Non sai che cosa mangiare? Prendi un jackfruit, lo tagli, lo peli, lo cuoci.
Widely grown all over the country, the jackfruit is one of the largest fruits in the world. It is incredibly nutritious and versatile.
Tagliamo la parte centrale che è un po' più dura e la pelle.
One jackfruit can feed an entire family for several days and provides a reliable source of proteins, vitamins and carbohydrates. Most importantly, it is drought resilient. And as farmers struggle to grow enough food due to the unpredictable weather patterns and extended droughts, jackfruit can replace many staples like rice that require a lot of water to grow. The chef, renowned for his innovative take on traditional recipes, is visiting a local farming family in Sri Lanka's central province and joins Rajama in the kitchen to learn how to make one of Sri Lanka's most popular dishes, Polo's curry, featuring jackfruit as its main ingredient.
අපි පවුලෙම ඔක්කොමලාම පොලොස් කන්න හරි කැමතියි. ඒක ඇවිල්ලා රස දෙයක් තමයි පොලොස් කියන්නේ. එක පොලොස් මාළුවෙන් බත් ටික ඔක්කොම කන්න පුළුවන්. ඒ තරම් ආසයි ඒ පොලොස් මාළුවට අපි.
Abbiamo messo tutta la cipolla, l'aglio, tutti i profumi e adesso ha messo il latte fatto spremendo il cocco fresco. Si mette il jackfruit così e si lascia cuocere per 5-6 ore.
Rajama says that jackfruit can provide a hearty meal when other foods are lacking. The family have seen how the climate has affected their livestock and their livelihood. Without reliable rainfall, they struggle to grow enough fodder and the animals produce less milk.
ඉස්සර අපිට වල් ගොඩක් තිබ්බා වැස්සේම කාලෙන් කාලෙට වහිනවා. දැන් මේ තියෙන කාලෙ විදියට අරියට වැස්සන ඉඩෝර කාලෙට අපිට සත්තු ටික අරන් ගිහිල්ලා කෑම කන්න බඳින්න කන්න අඩුයි.
Through a government project funded by the UN's International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD, farmers are learning about the benefits of jackfruit, not only for their nutritious value, but also as a source of income. Rajama and other farmers in the area can sell their surplus fruit to a nearby food processing factory. Funded with the IFAD loan, this factory makes dried snacks for a growing local and international market.
The livelihood of farmers in Sri Lanka is very much influenced by the season and the health of the ecosystem. So the role of IFAD in collaboration with the government of Sri Lanka is to support projects in strengthening their resilience to climate change.
To build their resilience, farmers across the country are trained in climate-smart farming practices and provided with efficient irrigation systems and netting to protect their crops from an increase in insects. Rajama's family were taught to make silage from grass to feed the animals and how to use manure and other waste from their farm to make organic compost. As well as improving soil fertility and increasing their yields, they can also earn additional income by selling their compost to neighboring farms.
La famiglia che lavora la terra cerca di sfruttare in maniera positiva in modo da avere sempre un beneficio e questo è importante nell'equilibrio del clima perché ci deve essere uno scambio, tanto prendo e tanto do, per cui la piccola azienda agricola è proprio questo, è la conservazione del territorio.
By protecting their resources with climate-smart practices, farmers in Sri Lanka are striving to stay one step ahead of climate change, but might need to rely more upon the hardy and versatile jackfruit.
Anche con un jackfruit si può fare un grande piatto.
Well, come back now to our conversation. Matt McGrath, BBC News, I'm sure you have a question for one of our panelists. Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Marina. I'd like to ask Esther a question. You touched on earlier that the media only cover small-scale farmers when there's a big disaster. But we talk a lot in journalism about loss and damage and loss and damages that happen over a longer period of time. What's your experience of loss and damage, and how can we tell that story to a broad international audience?
So the question for Estrella. Maybe Estrella is not there. Okay, she's
Hello,
there.
Can you hear me? Yes, okay. You know, the extent of the damage in a particular disaster is being done by governments because they have the means to really say the statistics. No? But at the farmer level, what we can do is to share pictures of fallen trees, of our houses that do not have roofs, for example, already. So, but what we really want for media to really cover is the initiatives that small farmers are also taking to be climate resilient. Because we have so many things that are being done on the ground, but somehow they are not mainstreamed in the media. For example, if you will see our website, our members have taken hundreds of videos of what they are doing, but I don't think you know them. How do we promote this? Because only when our role is made visible, then we can be highlighted, and then can we be supported in our work, and there can be financing also in the work we do. So that's our main problem, the initiatives we take. How can we highlight it? How can media capture it? Especially because in many farmers' organizations, we don't have a professional communications person. We just take our own videos, put it in Facebook, something like that.
Thank you, Estrella. And is there a question you would like to ask to our panelists? And I also recommend to be short in answers because we are running out of time. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, my question is for Matt, no, because but I hope it's not being taken as a bilateral chat. But my question is really for Matt as a media person. How would you think we could promote our work with the media? How can we catch the attention of the media in the work that we do?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a bilateral chat with you anytime, Esther. There's no problem. Yeah, it's very difficult for organizations such as yours and to get that story of the small farmers in front of people, because it's like water crisis, it's like the food crisis. When we talk about climate and environment at the moment, we're still talking about it in the realm of the politics and the science. It's only now starting to become something that's the lived experience of people. So I would say that up to now, that's been a very difficult story to tell because of all these other actors on the stage. But I think, as we've touched on already, the issue about food and food security, the impact we're seeing from various crises, the fuel crisis, the cost of living crisis, the Ukraine crisis, the climate crisis, all making the question of how we get our food more relevant to people more of the time, and telling positive stories about what can be done. I think the timing is becoming more good for that type of story to come on. I think we're moving into an era when people want to know what can be done. They're sick of bad news, to be honest. People don't want to hear just more disaster. They want to hear some message of hope. So it was interesting hearing from Lara, and it was interesting hearing from you that there are lots of messages of hope and strong stories out there. And we've just got to find a way. I think, honestly, it comes down to often personal connections, being able to connect with people who are journalists in the field or working in this area, with the people who have the knowledge, and to be able to build those personal relationships. And I think for me, that's a really important part of actually doing a panel like this, to get to see you guys, to get to hear your stories, and to think more roundedly about how we cover these issues as we go forward. Because I think ultimately it is all about, as Lara touched on, it is all about personal relationships. Food is very personal. It's basic for all of us, as is the planet. So, telling that story, telling the good aspects of that story shouldn't be a problem. I hope that we can perhaps build on that going forward.
Can I add something quickly?
Of course.
Esther, I think you have so much. I don't know your community. I've never been there, but I can imagine. I can imagine that the hard work that all of you do in that community also brings you together in an incredible way. And we all know that alone our voices are tiny. But when we are able to join in a larger chorus and speak together, the voices get bigger. So maybe something to think about would be taking the beautiful work you're doing and bringing that around a table and inviting people in your community, the ones who live just down the road, who have no idea how you are fighting climate change or the resilience that you need because of climate change. A dinner in a field with every single member of the community in your town begins to talk in chorus, begins to be a voice that maybe can be heard on the other side of the planet, where there's a journalist and says, hey, these farmers are doing incredible things, but what they're doing is they're bringing their community together and educating them so that together they can start facing this problem. Because the farm problem is not just the farmer's problem, it's also who's coming to market, who's buying the food, who's cooking the food. So unite, be together, use a chorus of a voice. I think that is the beginning of telling any story.
Thank you so much. Joe, I would like to say something. My question to you would be, instead, really, what should we expect from the next COP27? Which is a tough question, but feel free.
It's a really good question. And actually, you know, Matt sort of threw the gauntlet a little bit when he said, well, why isn't someone chewing up my ear about what is the next big story? So let me throw out a couple for all of you at this journalism festival to consider. And I think the first responses to your question, COP27 follows just a year after COP26. And at COP26, there were a lot of commitments that were made. 1.7 billion that was going to go to indigenous people. There was a commitment that was made by many countries on going net zero. There were commitments that were made that said that climate finance would go so that at least 50% would go to adaptation. And why that is important is that currently we have less than 17 or 20% essentially of overall money that goes into climate actually goes to adaptation. And it relates very much to smallholder farmers, right? Unless money and resources are going into making things that are really important for that jackfruit farmer, rural roads, small infrastructure. When I was in Mozambique and when I was in Egypt, getting aquaponics projects out there so that they can just be food sufficient. These are small investments, but really critical, and the weakest link really in the entire chain. Let's call the credibility of those commitments. And so I would want to call it the credibility COP. Are you really credible when you say that you're making commitments with respect to resources, with money, with how much you're going to put into adaptation, and how much you're going to help smallholder farmers? So that's the first one. The second one actually relates to what Esther said and what the video showed as well. We have so many foods, and these are solutions, but we have so many foods that are really fantastic. I come from India, and I have 5 kinds of flour just in my Italian kitchen here in Rome, right? And they're all brought from India. So clearly, I have to go back to a local market somewhere and find them, but they're not available in Rome for me. So let's make indigenous foods popular. They are healthy, they are grown by small-scale farmers, and they're extremely nutritious. In Italy, we've got the advantage of a culture that is really treats food with a lot of respect and love and beauty, which is Laura's point, which I really liked. We should leverage that, and we should think about small foods that can really change the way we think about vulnerability and resilience today. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Now I think it's time to open our discussion to the public. I'm sure somebody of you can join us with our conversation, and maybe you can approach here because we cannot come with a microphone to you today. So if you want to approach here, make question, and I will also repeat it to the public. Anybody? Okay, please can you come here? No, it's fine. Okay, you can make a question, and then I will maybe repeat with the microphone, because we have these COVID rules. We cannot share the microphone today. Not yet. We will in the future, hopefully.
Thanks for the presentation, first of all. And my question is about technologies and the combination with agriculture. So what would be the role of tech and sensor and artificial intelligence, machine learning in this agriculture world, and how we can mix together in a sustainable way, and if it is possible to do it. What is the pros and cons about the tech and agriculture? Thanks.
Thank you. Let me repeat the question before. So the question was very interesting about how technology, IT, can improve agriculture in a sustainable way. So let me direct this question to Joe.
Sure. So I'll just give you an example, right? Such a great question. Blockchain technology. Blockchain technology essentially lets you track and trace where the food was produced, what was the carbon footprint of, say, one jackfruit that was produced, how much was the carbon that was released, and you know that because we've done actually a lot of the calculations, but also as it goes through the entire marketing chain. As those chips get produced, as it goes to the next distributor, as it comes to your plate, you know exactly where it was produced, how much carbon was released, and what is the overall carbon content of that entire spectrum of activities. This is really important and key if we want to start thinking about certification and labeling. Labeling and certification actually has been going on in the world for a long time, except we don't have global standards for it. The world is now recognizing the importance of carbon markets. So on one side, if I've got a food that is low carbon, I can actually sell that, carbon offset, get money for my small-scale producer, and I can verify it because I've got blockchain technology. So huge potential. Lots of discussion on what are the potential pitfalls. I'm just going to mention one because the speaker mentioned it. Artificial intelligence and algorithms also mean that you're training your algorithm on past data, which means that all the biases that are there in past data, women being completely ignored, marginalized people being completely ignored in past data, then you risk taking that forward in your forward strategic thinking as well if you keep using your past data. So with algorithms that are using past data to train themselves, you've got to be, amongst many other things, careful about biases. Thanks.
Okay, more questions? You can even ask in Italian, of course. If anybody wants to stand up and make a questions. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, guide?
National policies that actually help towards this end. I mean, things like growing the right crop in the right agroclimatic zone. I mean, there are countries where your current policies actually hinder that.
Absolutely right.
I'm wondering whether or not you can address, how do we address that, and how we can take that conversation into our storytelling.
Absolutely.
Okay, so she's asking how can we translate this conversation in concrete government policies? Okay.
Okay, so very quickly, actually, I mean, the power that journalists bring is fantastic, right? You all know Silent Spring, you all know Hungry Tide, Amitav Ghosh's book, etc. So Silent Spring essentially created the entire environmental movement, not just in the United States, but then the world over. So I'm really hoping very much that all of you are going to be writing these stories. Okay, but let me give you two examples. In Kenya, first, international agencies do have to respect, and I respect this ideology hugely, we have to respect what governments want, right? So they lead, we provide them with advice, but it's really important as to how they are determining how their nationally determined contributions will be dealt with. But for example, when we worked in eastern Kenya as well as in northern Kenya, this is IFAD, we realized that a lot of the indigenous crops had moved out, and many small-scale farmers were now producing corn. Corn is not usually used in ugali, so their traditional food. And it's actually cassava that used to be grown. So IFAD's project is actually giving financial access, again, using ICT, using M-Pesa, to get farmers to move back from corn to cassava. So that's one example, but that's coming from advice, which we are routing through governments, because that's really important. In northern Kenya, a lot of the past growing patterns in terms of trees was growing eucalyptus. And when you look at the upper Tana River, which is again where we have a large investment in, that was taking away a lot of the water. Eucalyptus brings a lot of water, and that was influencing just the amount of water that was going down into Nairobi, and the Tana River actually produces 70% of the power in Kenya. So that was really affecting the entire population. The investments in Kenya then have managed to change agricultural patterns so that they are no longer drought-inducing, are getting farmers to change their agricultural practices so that they can earn money on the food that they are producing, and is leading to greater power independence in Kenya as well.
Great, thank you so much. And I have a question for Lara. How are you integrating the climate indigenous food in your work every day?
Well, because we have refectorios in 9 different countries, from Merida, Mexico, to Rio de Janeiro, to the United States, San Francisco, and New York, Italy, we are learning. We've created a learning network between us all so that we are able to learn more about the local farmers and the indigenous foods that are in those areas, so that we can also try to share a recipe coming from Mexico with a certain ingredient or product can then be shared in San Francisco or in New York. There are opportunities. Cooking is always an opportunity to learn something and to immediately share that information with the people who are dining at your table, with the volunteers that are serving both in the kitchen and in the dining room, and with the greater public. So that is one step towards being able to share those indigenous products. Hopefully someday we will have a refectorio in Sri Lanka, or
Great.
in Singapore, or in Asia, or in Africa. We have projects in the works right now, and the more we were able to have one tiny toe, not even the whole foot, in a different part of the world, the more we can learn from each other. And I think it's sharing those stories, sharing those recipes, as Carlo Cracco was doing, but with a larger public, sharing them with people who are sitting at the table and eating that kind of food. It creates a sensibility, a knowledge of the other, and also, as I've seen Esther's face, you put a face on a story and a plot of land and the struggle that that person is facing.
Thank you so much. And now I really would like Estrella Penunia to address through the media, through our audience today, a message, a short message, 1 minute. She wants really to say something today, I'm sure. Estrella.
Okay, thank you very much. I know media has very big power. It has big power to influence public opinion. And when the public is on the side of a person, or for example of a farmers, that it can move governments to act with urgency. We know that because in many of our advocacies on land rights, for example, farmers will do hunger strike, farmers will do a long march, like what we're doing right now in the Philippines. We have a long march right now for good governance. Media comes to us, and media tells this story. So we know that you have power, and we hope that this power can be used to highlight the family farmers' role, not as victims, but as solution providers in making our planet healthy, solution providers in making a resilient planet, sustainable food systems, empowering food systems. So please help us do this. We are ready to work with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Estrella. Thanks, everybody. Join us, our panelists, Lara Gilmore, Joe Puri, Estrella Penunia, and McGrath. I really would like to thank also IFAD. And if you want to know more about IFAD projects, you can join their website and also their YouTube channel. And thank everybody. So we'll continue this conversation, I'm sure, for next time. Thank you.
Thank you for being a fantastic chair.
Thank you.